The best way to learn a language? Immersion, living where the language is spoken and using it every day. But if that's not in the cards for you this year, you can still learn a language the second best way, and that's with Babbel. Be a better you in 2024 with Babbel, the science-backed language learning app that actually works. Don't pay hundreds of dollars for private tutors or waste hours on apps that don't really help you speak the language. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel's designed by real people for real conversations. Babbel's tips and tools are approachable, accessible, rooted in real-life situations, and delivered with conversation-based teaching so you're ready to practice what you've learned in the real world. For instance, I've been using Babbel's convenient courses to help me learn basic conversational skills in German while I'm getting ready for a little trip I'm planning. It's not a language I'd ever studied before, but I find the lessons really easy and kind of like hand-holding me through learning a completely new language to me. And it's reassuring to know that with the help of Babbel, I'll be able to greet people, order food, and ask for directions without having to consult language apps while I'm in Deutschland. I'm still learning. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel has over 16 million subscriptions sold. Plus, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Here's a special limited-time deal for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/vulgar. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/vulgar, spelled BABBEL.com/vulgar. Rules and restrictions may apply.
With your long-forgotten name, we call upon you.
We call upon you.
In the words of the unspeakable language, we call upon you.
We call upon you.
By the spilt blood of the wicked, who walk upon this world, sprouting the words of false idols, we call upon you.
We call upon you.
On the land of the dead harvest, that which brings the earth itself into your service, Yamal, we call upon you.
We call upon you. We call upon you. We call upon you.
Yamal calls upon you.
The Sprouting, a Call of Cthulhu actual play podcast by Blighthouse Studio. Find us on your podcatcher of choice.
Hello, and welcome to Vulgar History, a feminist women's history comedy podcast. I'm your host, Anne Foster. And this is part 2 of this whole season is called There's Something About Mary Queen of Scots, but we're telling the story of Mary Queen of Scots, and this is the second part of that. So it's kind of a mini series within a series. There are so many people in this story. When I've been researching the various books I'm about to tell you what books I've been looking at, every time a new person comes on, inevitably a man, I'm just like, okay, like I can't imagine he's going to be important as well. So I just kind of like read ahead, and then it's like retroactively, I'm like, oh, he is important. Then I have to go back in and like learn who he is so I can introduce him to you when he joins the story. It's just, there's an ensemble cast in this story. And so last time we were talking about Mary Queen of Scots was born in Scotland. She became Queen of Scots aged 6 days when her father died. And then she went to France. And then I thought it was interesting that what the television show Reign spent, I believe, 62 episodes telling over 3 seasons of television programming. I covered last time in an hour and a half, just kind of Mary in France. And I do think I'm going to bring up Reign throughout this whole series within a series, because that's where I first became interested in Mary Queen of Scots' story. I think that that's part of what was so smart about that show and what made it such a good premise for a show, because when Mary comes back to Scotland, the stuff that she did, she was busy, as we're going to see. It's harder to insert more, wacky plot lines and hijinks around how busy she was when she was literally in Scotland ruling. But in France, that's a time period, that's a period of like numerous years, like 13 years or something, where not a lot was written about what she did because no one was paying so much attention to her at that point, really. So Reign was able to just invent lots of different things to have happened to her. Anyway, it was a great premise for a show. And I think it's notable that when they got to season 4 of Reign, which is when she comes to Scotland, they really put that off as long as they could for the reasons I was just explaining. Like when she gets to Scotland, well, first of all, the whole cast of characters is going to change. But also there's a lot less wiggle room to invent plot lines for her to get involved in. Anyway, so I'm going to tell this episode assuming you've heard part 1 already, but also assuming it's maybe been a week since you heard part 1. So when we introduce people, I'll re-remind you who they are. I'll re-remind you what names we're giving them. Because everybody in the story increasingly is called James, Charles, and Janet, and George. And for my own sense of whimsy, honestly, it's so I can tell them apart. But hopefully it'll help you to tell them all apart. I've given people a whimsical nickname, often a thing that they were actually called at the time. Sometimes just a name I made up, just so we can tell all these people apart they all have the same surname too. Everyone's a Stuart. Anyway, this is part 2, Mary Queen of Scots, part 2 here on the Vulgar History Podcast. Again, she was in France. She went there to marry the heir to the throne. Then the king died, so her husband became the king, so she was the Queen of France. But then that husband died, making her both a teen widow, the Dowager Queen of France, I guess, but also, so the king who died, her husband, Francis, as they said on the television show Reign, he had several younger siblings, including his younger brother Charles, who's going to be the new king. And so Mary and her uncles, the de Guise uncles, who were like so ambitious, were like, well, what if we do like a King Henry VIII / Arthur situation and just like marry her to the younger sibling? But Catherine de Medici, who was the mother of the French kings, she, like the de Guises had so much power and control when Mary was married to Francis. And she was just like, no, like if she lets Charles, the new French king, the new French boy king, if she lets him marry Mary, then the de Guises are going to get power again. And she didn't want that. So that was just truly never an option. And Mary was just kind of like, what am I going to do? And she stayed in France for a while, just trying to figure out what she was going to do. And kind of no one knew what to do with her either. I think we get to this, but it's something like a year between Francis dying and Mary actually going to Scotland. So I think like she was in mourning for a while, 40 days or something, wandering around looking like a ship's sail. But then eventually she just had to figure out what to do. And it was like, is she going to go just like live out the rest of her days, as Dowager Queen of France, but Queen of Scotland, but in France? Is she going to go like to a nunnery? Like, what's the plan? And various people came to her with various plans. And eventually the one that she decided to do was her older half-brother, whose name is James Stewart. And as we call him on the show, Hollywood icon, Jimmy Stewart, came to her. He was in Paris. Remember, he was there for her wedding. He had gone there to go to university. He got radicalized by the Huguenots, the Protestants there. And he was like, listen, I'm kind of in charge in Scotland right now. Like, yes, I know, like, this is him talking, not me. Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart was like, well, Mary. Anyway, he had been part of the group of the Asshole Lords, Protestants, in Scotland who had run her mother, who had like, usurped power from her mother. They became the Council of the 24 Assholes. And Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart had been part of that, but he was like, like, what if we bring over Mary and like she'll be like, quote unquote, the queen, but like Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart, can sort of be in control of things. And she was just like she had to do something. And she's like, well, let's do Scotland. Like, I have to do something, let's do Scotland. So she got her uncles, the de Guise uncles. This is like one of the last things they're going to do, although they were all over the last episode. When she gets to Scotland, they kind of fuck off and forget about her. So they helped her arrange her like transport from France to Scotland. There were fears that the English might try to intercept and kidnap her, and this is recurring. There's a lot of people constantly planning to kidnap this person. So why would the English want to do that? Well, because she's a threat, because the Catholics, there were Catholic people in England and in Scotland who felt that Mary should be the Queen of England instead of Elizabeth, and maybe people who supported Elizabeth would kidnap her to stop her from doing that, or maybe people who wanted her to be queen would kidnap her to make her be Queen of England. Regardless, her uncle spread false rumors about where she was going, like what her itinerary was going to be, where she was going to land. And for the record, the English didn't capture her, but an English fleet did follow close behind just to like see where she was going and what she was up to. So she rode on There was like 2 galleys, which are like big ships, along with like some smaller transport ships of like her belongings, which are like, she's a queen. She's incredibly wealthy. She gets sort of an allowance as the Dowager Queen of France. And she's moving, like, if you imagine the contents of a Renaissance castle from France to Scotland. So there's a lot of ships. So her galley that she was riding on there with her were, in a return appearance, and they're going to be here for basically the rest of the story, the 4 Marys, who were her 4 best friends, who were all the daughters of important noble Scottish families, whose names were all Mary. There's a rumor I heard that she made them change the names to Mary so they would have the same name as her, but they were all actually called Mary. Anyway, glad to have them back in the story. So they're there on the ship with her as well. Also along for the ride were other members of what I'm just going to call her entourage. She has various French servants and courtly people who she's bringing with her from France to Scotland. This included 2 French poets, both named Pierre, one of whom we're going to talk about later, one of the Pierres. Some drama happens around him. Anyway, so the other galley carried the rest of her staff. The rest of her staff included these people who are on her payroll, which included people like a surgeon, 2 medical men, an apothecary, a tailor, an upholsterer, which is maybe the same thing as a embroiderer. I know she had her own personal embroiderer. We're going to talk a lot about her embroideries because there's a lot to say. A painter, a lute player, ushers, a confessor, so like a priest, a chaplain, a barber, which I guess would be, I don't know if that cuts, I don't know if she was getting haircuts, but like the men around her were getting haircuts and their beards trimmed and stuff, I guess. A stocking maker, and her fool. She had a lady, actually she had 2 lady fools, and we'll talk about them in a bit. So these are all French people. She was just coming in with a bunch of French immigrants, I guess. And then, as I said, there's all these other smaller ships with all of her luggage. So she was bringing over furniture, gowns, paintings, works of art, bed linens, tapestries. She traveled with these huge, beautiful, like wall-sized tapestries. And like when she was in Scotland and she'd go from one castle to another on a trip, she would often bring the tapestries with her just to sort of, honestly, she brought the tapestries. And when we talk about it, when she gets to the castle, they're described as like Turkish rugs as well. Like she's moving into these kind of like cold stone buildings and she's just like, let's just make it cozy in here. She's doing like a Bobby Burke, just like really making it feel more like home. She also brought over 100 horses and mules. So I do want to mention about her fashion. So she brought over like a lot of gowns and they were colorful and they were beautiful. But she, in this period of time, she only ever wore black. Sun was black and white. And this is a statement of her mourning for her husband, Francis. And that's interesting because if you recall when he died, there was a whole thing about Catherine de' Medici and her daughters all wore black, which is the color for Italian royal mourning. But then Mary notably wore white, the color for French royal mourning. But also she wears black and it's maybe to just kind of fit in a bit better. Like she knew she was a Catholic queen going into a Protestant country. And so if she was just wearing all these flashy colors all the time, maybe she wanted to be taken seriously as a queen, and we'll see how that goes. But anyway, so she was always wearing black, and she was always giving gifts, clearly her love language. Like she was always giving gifts to her friends and to people who she wanted to support or she hoped they would be her allies. And so she ended up passing along most of these colorful dresses to her close female friends and associates eventually. And also speaking of the 100 horses, so they were impounded, I guess is the word. Like they were caught up by the, what's it called when you're going from one place to another, the immigration or whatever. They're caught at the border. The horses were kept impounded for a month by the English because of paperwork issues, which honestly just sounds familiar to me, just in terms of like when you're flying places, the horses didn't have visas or whatever. But lest you think, even this moment of just like her on a ship leaving France would be straightforward and wouldn't involve death. Guess what? So she's on her like giant galley, and just at the mouth of the harbor, like where the harbor goes out into the ocean, a fishing boat was rammed into by another ship. And she saw this happen because she was standing like on the deck of her galley. And so the fishing boat sank, or it just started to sink. All the crew on board started to sink. Mary was like, oh my God, because she's like very generous. She's very like helpful. She was witnessing this tragedy. So she was like, oh my God, can we help them? She begged the captain of her galley to save these drowning sailors. But the other boat, the boat dragged all the men down with it and they all drowned before anyone could go there and help. And so she was like, what does this mean as like an omen for me leaving France to go to Scotland? Feels like maybe not a good one. And people who saw her do this, they wrote about it. They talked about what her actions were like, what she looked like. And remember, she's 18 years old. So she remained on the deck, like at the rail, leaning over it. And you see in some of the movies about her and some of the paintings of her, they have this like iconic moment, her leaning on the rail. I believe in Rain, they show this. And she just kind of like bid adieu to France. She said something like, I probably will never see you again. And then like night fell and she was too melancholy to go into her room, where she just really thought the fresh air would be helpful to her. So she's like, I just want to sleep like up here, like on the deck. So she got her servants to bring her bed up onto the deck, and then with her bedding, and then she slept in the open air that night. So usually the commute from France to Scotland took something like a week, like 7 days, but they just had favorable winds. So that's a good omen. And they arrived there in 5 days, which was practically a record. The people in Scotland hadn't expected her to arrive yet because there wasn't, like Morse code machines. No one could call ahead to be like, oh, actually, we're coming faster. So no one knew. So she just arrived kind of randomly. It was an unusually damp and depressing morning. A cold sea mist cloaked the shore as they arrived, which was another spooky omen. And the ships anchored at the entrance to the harbor. And I just remembered, I forgot to tell you all my sources. And because I am quoting from a whole bunch of books, I want to make sure that all these authors get their shout outs, because this is a story. When I went in to do these episodes, I was like, American and Scots, I've written about this. Like, I know the story. Like, I'll just like refresh my memory. But especially this earlier part, I did not know so much of this stuff. And I learned a lot from books, including Embroidering Her Truth, Mary Queen of Scots in the Language of Power by Claire Hunter, Daughters of the North, Jean Gordon and Mary Queen of Scots by Jennifer Morag Henderson, Mary Queen of Scots, The True Life of Mary Stuart by John Guy, and Homecoming, The Scottish Years of Mary Queen of Scots by Rosemary Goring, as well as I verified numerous names on Wikipedia just to be like, which James Hamilton is this? Because everyone has the same names. Anyway, I will link to all those books in the show notes. They're all really, honestly, so helpful. And as we get into the later episodes, there's going to be those books continue to be helpful as well as other books. Oh, I also referred to the book, The Mary Was Here, Mary Queen of Scots, and Where She Went, the book that's put out by the Historic Scotland Society or whatever, that just talks about all the castles where she went. So she's just arrived. The weather is foggy, misty, ominous. But anyway, she knew her job and she knew what she needed to do, and that was to be the queen and to win everybody over to her side. So she came out, big smiles, just like a celebrity on a red carpet, and she had enormous personal magnetism and charisma. And a lot of what happens in this story, just bear that in mind, like the way that she's able to win people over to her side, or also alternately, the way that some people just can't stand her. She has like she's just got a real charisma about it. And when she was out among the public, she was always so like friendly and kind, and I don't know, whatever. Like if she was a celebrity today, she'd be like signing autographs, taking selfies. Like she knew that it was important for the regular everyday people to love her. And guess what? They did. But yeah, again, there was like no great crowd there to greet her or officials. Like they just kind of showed up and everyone's like, oh, what? She's here? So they kind of, her like companions or whatever, they're like, let's just go have like lunch and trying to figure this out. So they just sort of went over to a rich person's house while the like actual dignitaries like very quickly rode there on horseback from, well, firstly, people had to go to the Edinburgh, I guess, to be like, oh my God, she's here. And then they have to return from Edinburgh to get to where she was. So she was in a place called Leith is where they were, which is like not far from Edinburgh, but far enough. Anyway, so by the time they were done eating this meal, some people had made it to greet her, including the person who had partially convinced her to come here and do this, her half-brother, Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart. And I don't think I mentioned this before in the previous episode, and this is what's happening is I'm recording these in order, but I'm also researching the next one while I'm recording this one. And so when I find something out later that pertains to a previous episode, I have to let you know. So I don't think I mentioned this last time because I didn't know when I recorded last time. So her mother, Marie de Guise, had warned her not to trust Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart, probably because Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart had been like one of the leaders of the rebel asshole lords who like usurped her. Anyway, but Mary was like, everyone seems to be an asshole. I have to choose one of them to side with. This guy's my half brother and he seems powerful, so let's go with him. Also arriving there were two people I believe I mentioned last time, both called James Hamilton, a father and son duo. because the dad was the Earl of Arran. We call him Arran, and the son is going to be Arran Jr. So they're both there. They're the guys, their families, the Hamiltons, who like traditionally were often the regents of when there was, because there was like 5 boy kings in a row or something in Scotland. So they're like tangentially related to the royal family. At this point, I think the Earl of Arran is like next in line to be Scottish king. Anyway, yeah, so all these guys are on the Protestant side. Mary, of course, is Catholic, but she's coming in here. Like, she's not just showing up with no plans. Like, she knows that what she wants to have happen, not unlike Mary's portrayal in the television show Reign, is to let the Protestants keep being Protestant and the Catholics can keep being Catholic and not try to force religion one way or the other. And this is crucial because, well, firstly, Scotland was only just, like, the Protestant Reformation had like just started while she was in France. So it was still kind of like not quite cemented. It was like, it felt sort of precarious, like it could switch over to being Catholic, but she was like, don't worry, like everyone can keep their own same religion. But, you know, things had been happening like not so long ago. Mary the First had been the queen in England, and she took over as a Catholic queen with a Protestant king before her, and she became known for how she would like burn lots of Protestants, and she was known as Bloody Mary. And that's like Mary, Queen of Scots' cousin, basically, also called Mary, also Catholic. So everyone's just kind of like, what are you going to do? And she's like, don't worry. Like, I might be a redheaded person related to that other person, also called Mary, also Catholic queen. But she's like, but I'm chill, so don't worry about it. Anyway, because her horses at this point were still in impound, they borrowed horses to process up to the royal palaces at Holyrood for a reception. And so it was noted that when she arrived, Mary and the Marys, like they were all dressing like to match, like they dressed to impress, but they also coordinated like a bride and her bridesmaids at a wedding, where it's just going, I'm Mary and these are the Marys, and they look great together. Or, you know, like when you see Blackpink or BTS, where it's just kind of like they're a group, but they also match. And their thing was they wore black and white. Mary, Queen of Scots, just to recap as well, was like literally, I think, 6 feet tall. Tall for a woman now, tall for a woman then. Everybody mentioned how she had this like peaches and cream, like really pale skin, which was the beauty standard of the era. And she also had striking long auburn hair. So just like red hair, pale skin. She knew she looked good in black and white, which is why she wore those colors a lot. But anyway, she and the Marys showed up, and it's just like, ooh, like this is French. Like this is chic. Like the people in Scotland were just like, okay. Again, to bring it back to Reign, that's a bit of what that show was doing. People talk about the costumes a lot on that show to be like, that's not accurate. And it's like, yeah, they weren't trying to be. What they were trying to do, like what they dressed Adelaide Kane, who played Mary in that show, in was a lot of like couture gowns, like high fashion. Because to a modern day audience, you wanted to impress upon the fact that like Mary and the Marys, like they were fashion forward. They were trailblazers. They were wearing couture gowns of their era. To our modern eyes, when you see people wearing kind of like oldie time clothes, it's like, oh, those are oldie time clothes. And someone could be like, oh, that's a fine dress. And we're like, oh, okay, guess that one's nicer than the other one. But we don't know. But when you're watching a show, and inherently, you can just, when they look like an elegant, expensive dress that you would see today, then you can translate that. And anyway, so they're just coming in having a fashion moment. And celebrations began to celebrate her return. So this is in Edinburgh. There was bonfires, there was music. People were just rejoicing. Like people were excited to have her back. Like they were just like, this is great. We have this new, like the queen is here. She's beautiful. She's glamorous. Like any occasion to party. When she wanted to go to, like when it was time for her to go to bed at the palace, several hundred goofballs congregated under her window, playing fiddles and other string instruments, apparently singing out of tune and just being like, just having a nice time. So it's like she arrives and like everyone's excited. Asterisk. Not everyone, but the like everyday subjects of her kingdom were excited she was back. And yeah, so she's staying at Holyrood House, which is a palace you can still visit. It's apparently the most magnificent of the Scottish royal palaces. So after she'd been there a while, she decided like, okay, let's like redo the entry into Edinburgh, but maybe, you know, not on borrowed horses and like with people knowing to expect me. So then they had like a grand procession entry. And I think it's having just had the coronation of Charles III in England, like, which was not what we're talking about here, but a very old-fashioned sort of thing. But if you think about the scale of that, just like the carriage going through the streets, the amount of people out there cheering, like to that level of excitement when she had her re-entry. So there were pageants and performances, masks, which were like kind of like plays. And some of these were written, or the asshole lords had either paid somebody to write them or they wrote them themselves by some other asshole playwright that had a lot of like, ooh, being Protestant is important. And we like being Protestant and Catholics are kind of terrible. So there's like some like not so subtle messaging in these performances. That being said, some of the people not excited about her being there boycotted this whole situation, including Aaron Jr. and Sr., as well as goddamn John Knox. So I think I'm not a fan of John Knox. I hate how much he's in the story, and I hate that I have to talk about him. But I do because he is regrettably incredibly important in this story. And he just makes me so mad when I'm reading the books to researchers. Every time he shows up, like I literally, like not intentionally, I just like shake my head. I'm just like, no. Like when I need to confirm facts about him and I look him up on a search engine, I'm just like, ugh, and I like close the tab. Anyway, so who's this guy? So he was the main driving force behind the Scottish Reformation in the sense of he was a very persuasive speech maker. He could get people really riled up. He had very firmly held beliefs that he wanted to force everybody else to have those same beliefs, which were inspired by Calvinism, which is the kind of Protestantism that he learned when he was in Geneva for some reason. In terms of this story, like this is the Vulgar History podcast. This isn't like the history of the Reformation podcast. So here's what you need to know. He's a fucking nightmare person. I personally am offended by his existence. And he's also incredibly popular, but like in an incel way. Like everybody came to all of his sermons. He was the main minister at the main church in Edinburgh, which was like a paid position. Everybody came every week. It was like they're all listening to like Jordan Peterson on the Joe Rogan podcast. Like they were just like his personal magnetism, I guess, was part of why he was as successful as he was. He also was a writer. He had written a book/pamphlet, which was called The First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women, which was, I'm not going to read it, but what I've read about it is that he had just written this like a couple of years before. And it was basically saying women should not be in charge of anything. Women should not be rulers. And if they are, then good Christians should murder them because women shouldn't be in charge of anything. And he wrote this at the same period of time when Mary Queen of Scots' mother, Marie de Guise, was still regent. So that was kind of like he was criticizing her. He didn't like having a woman in charge. But it was also at the same time as when Mary I was in charge in England. And she was like burning all the Protestants. So like I can see why a Protestant minister would be like not a fan of Mary I, but he really turned this into a real personal crusade about just like he hated women, he hated Catholics. The worst thing you could be to him was a Catholic woman. Yeah, and he was inciting revolution that all good Christians, by which he meant men, because I think he wanted women to stay home and like have babies. Like all good Christians should depose women leaders was kind of his deal. But anyway, the everyday people of Edinburgh, as much as they might like listen to his podcast, they're just like, we love this party. We love our glamorous new queen. This is great. And that was like, Mary knew this. And that's part of why she really made sure to always be good. And so that she would always have the public on her side. Like this was like politically very advantageous to her. But also she was just like a people pleaser. She liked people to like her. And yeah, so these like Calvinist inspired assholes dominated Privy Council or like the town council, but it was like such a small amount of people actually in relation to the overall population of Scotland, like not to get into like the Highlands, which we'll get to. But anyway, so her first Sunday at Holyrood, she went to hear Catholic Mass in her private chapel, which was kind of like a compromise that she had reached where she was like, listen, I accept that this is like a Protestant country now. That's fine. But like, I'm Catholic. I was raised Catholic. I'm not going to change my religion. So I'm just going to like keep going to Catholic services myself. And her brother, Hollywood icon James Stewart, was like, sure, that's great. But of course, some John Knox fanboys came to heckle her as she like was walking over to her private chapel. They were shouting for the priest to be killed. But to his credit, also very cannily, Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart stood at the door of the chapel to protect Mary, which was kind of making her feel like, okay, you know what? Like I backed the right guy. Like my half-brother is helping me out, at least in this instance. But also he was out there, so when the guys were trying to break in, he could be like, hey, don't do that, but then wink at them to be like yet, you know. Anyway, John Knox hated Catholics, and he said to him, the celebration of one Catholic mass was worse than if 10,000 Catholics advanced an army to try to change the country's religion. So he's a man who speaks in extremes. Like, simmer down, John Knox. After this, Mary, she's just like, no, this is what I want to do. And so she issued a proclamation so everyone knew that she wanted to do this. The Protestants and Catholics, like, let's just be cool with each other. And also, please, nobody harass her servants or any member of her retinue for any reason at all, which is, I like that. This is like, could not be a more vague and like kind statement, but Aaron Jr. protested this. He was like, anyone who attends Catholic Mass is basically committing crime that is it's worse than murder. Like, don't do it. Nobody do it. So Mary was like, okay, can I talk to this John Knox guy? Because she was just like, first of all, the queen. Second of all, like she had been raised to be very privileged. People cared what she had to say. To some extent, she knew that she had this personal charisma and power, and she could like charm most men. But also she had been raised in France, which was a place where the monarch had not like basically absolute power. So people didn't fuck with the monarch. So she's like, okay, bring John Knox to me. Like, I'll get him to stop being an asshole. Like, this is within literal days of her arriving in Scotland. She was just like, gotta nip this in the bud with him, like, inciting people to murder me. So she brought along Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart to be in the meeting with her, both as a witness, but also to be like, look, like, I'm cool with Protestants. Let's stop inciting violence against me. But like right away, like as soon as he came in the room, practically, John Knox just like launched into like an impromptu sermon, just like mansplaining to her about why women shouldn't be rulers and how women rulers were terrible. And she was like, but like, I'm the queen. So like, what? And he's like, oh no, I don't mean you. I just mean like Mary the First, who is like burning Protestants in England. And she's like, but you said like, what are you trying to tell me? Just like, stop mansplaining. And he's like, well, you know, I'm cool to like live in a country where you're the monarch, because even St. Paul in the Bible had to live under the rule of Emperor Nero, who was evil and a terrible sinner. And Mary was like, are you just comparing me to Emperor Nero, bro? Like the son of Agrippina from the previous Vulgar History podcast? Anyway, Mary was stunned by his like wild debate style and the way that he didn't give a fuck and didn't treat her with respect. Ultimately, they were just like, okay, you can go now. And then she wept. She burst down crying in anger and frustration, which we're going to see a lot. She's a crier, nothing against that, comma. And the sorts of men who don't think that women should be in charge of anything in any leadership position would use that to be like, look, she's a weak woman, where it's like, no, she's just a crier. Some people just are. Anyway, but she didn't cry until after he left. John Knox hadn't seen her cry. And actually later, he was like, she's actually pretty good at debating me for a woman, which, okay. Anyway, so a bit more about John Knox. I can't talk about him for too long. It makes me too angry, but here's just some facts about this, unfortunately, main character in this story. So this way, Mary Queen of Scots was 18. He was 47 years old. He had been ordained as a priest, and then he worked as kind of like a bodyguard for George Wishart, who was the guy from last time who had been murdered by David Beaton. And then the assholes who had killed David Beaton, then they like hold up in a castle, kind of like holding it hostage to be like, make the country Protestant or else. And then the French captured them all. So they were there doing that. John Knox, I forget what I said last time about it exactly, but he wasn't one of the people who like killed David Beaton. But when he heard that these guys were holding this castle hostage for Protestantism, he's like, gotta go. Oh, I think at this point he was working as a lawyer, and he just like fucked off his law practice, like abandoned all of his clients. He was like, I have to go be with these revolutionaries. This is like a January 6th moment for me. And so he went and he like served as the chaplain for these guys, but eventually they were arrested, and then he had to go work in a French prison galley, Jean Valjean vibes. Then he went to Geneva, discovered Calvinism, which made him even more of a nightmare. And then he like officially devoted his life to screaming at everybody that they should convert as well. Prior to this, he had been in England as well. And that's where he had married his first wife, whose name was Marjorie, but she had since died. And he was known to consort a lot with the sex workers of Edinburgh. So the fact that he's just being all like, oh, women suck and I hate them, and they should all like not be horny and like stay home and mind children, except for the like sex workers who I pay to fuck. So he's just like the worst. Anyway, so 3 weeks after arriving, Mary Queen of Scots appointed her inaugural Privy Council, and it showed her intent to make Catholics and Protestants hand in hand working together to just like balance everything out and avoid civil war. She appointed her brother, Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart, as her chief advisor, which kind of provided continuity from the past few years where he had kind of been in charge. And also because at this point, she was just like, I need to trust someone and I choose him. And he also was like very much encouraging her in this direction of like, choose a middle path. Like, don't go like full Catholic, but don't go full Protestant, but just like hope that everyone will kind of play it cool, but also like try to not exacerbate things with England and Scotland. He's just like that song from West Side Story. He's just like, play it cool, Mary, and try and hopefully avoid no wars. So they were very much on the same page at this point. So of the people who comprised the Privy Council, there's 12 men, and 7 of them were Protestants, including Hollywood icon James Stewart, as well as Arran Sr., and then another guy, his name is William Maitland, who had been her mother's Secretary of State, but then he was in the group that like usurped her power, but he like had some skills that she needed. He's AKA the Scottish Machiavelli, is how people of his time referred to him. In Scots, they called him Michael Willie, which I think is just the Scots way of saying Machiavelli. Not sure. Anyway, he continues to be on, but just as a case study, like the fact that this guy, Scottish Machiavelli, had worked alongside Marie de Guise for years and then decided to switch and not back her anymore, but now he like is backing her daughter. We're going to see a lot of people doing this. There's a lot of switching back and forth teams. Like the only people who are like true to their actual religious beliefs and their own side of things are maybe John Knox. He does not waver from being on the side of whoever's the biggest asshole. And Mary herself. Everyone else is just like switching sides. And this is where I needed to give everybody whimsical names, because otherwise I'm like, wait, that guy, why is he there now? I'm like, oh, he's on that side now. And then the next page is like, now he's on that side. Like people just keep switching to the point I assumed it was a bunch of different people. No, it's just the same people switching. And so Maitland was sent to go to London to negotiate regarding the Treaty of Edinburgh, which I believe I spoke about last time. But it's this document that I believe Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart negotiated with Elizabeth's team, but Mary refused to sign it because it was an incredibly shitty deal for her. It was the document that said something along the lines of like, if Mary dies, then it was bad. I don't remember exactly what it was. I don't want to say it off the top of my head because I'll get it wrong. But anyway, it was just a shitty thing that was good for England and good for Protestants, but not good for Mary herself. Because at that point, Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart was kind of on side with England in the sense of like they were a Protestant country and Scotland was kind of a Protestant country. And he's like, let's just kind of like work for our own best interests for now. And so Maitland's job, Scottish Machiavelli, was to go to convince Elizabeth that if she acknowledged Mary's claim to the English throne, Mary would ratify this shitty treaty. That did not happen. Elizabeth did not buy that. She did not agree to that. Another person on the council was a guy who is going to come up again in future. His name is Lord Ruthven, which it's a cool name to me. I don't know in Scotland if that's just like a common last name a lot of people have, but Lord Ruthven was rumored to be a warlock and or necromancer, and he was actively dying of cancer, but that doesn't stop him from being a main character in the story for a while as well. And then of the Catholics who were chosen for the Privy Council, one of them was a guy, his name was George Gordon, aka 4th Earl of Huntly, aka Cock o' the North. And I need to tell you about this man. First of all, to his great credit, so he was Catholic, but he was like willing to make it seem like he was maybe going to compromise. So sometimes when he was down in Edinburgh, he would condescend to attend some of John Knox's sermons. So he would go into the like incel podcast studio with the other thousands of incels. So he would go, but like he wasn't enjoying himself. And what he would do is he would show his irritation with a preacher by pulling his bonnet down over his eyes, picking at his nails and muttering, "When these knaves have railed their fill, then they will hold their peace." So he's basically just being like, I'm just let these assholes get it out of their system. But the vibe of like pulling the bonnet over your eyes. Like anyone who's ever been in a meeting or honestly a church service that you find really boring, like that's the vibe, just this like bonnet over the eyes. So you might be able to tell. I like this guy. So George Gordon, Earl of Huntly, Cock o' the North, was the most powerful Catholic man in Scotland. So he's from the House of Huntly, which controlled much of the northeast, but their power base extended further around the Highlands and the far north. And we talked last time, I think, about the Highlands versus the Lowlands and how there's this like, again, it's another thing where it's just like, let's just try to like all play cool and not have a civil war sort of vibe. So Cock of the North had accompanied Mary's mother, Marie de Guise, when she had visited France that time, when she visited Mary in France. And after having spent that time in France, Cock of the North came back and he was just inspired by the French architecture and like tapestries to decorate his castle, Huntly Castle, in this like French style, which really stood out because the castle's in the middle of rural Aberdeenshire. In fact, Marie de Guise had stayed there once when she was on a progress and she was impressed with what he'd done with the place. So he's like a guy with a good eye for like interior design and that sort of thing. And he was the Cock o' the North because why was he so powerful? He had a personal charisma around him, but also just like his family connections and like his inherited role. People just relied on him. Like if he called supporters, like he could get a large number of followers and supporters from the surrounding countryside. He was the chief of a vast swath of territory in the north and northeast. He was also Lord Lieutenant of the North and had been or would be Sheriff of Inverness, Sheriff of Aberdeen, Privy Councillor, he was just named that, Lieutenant of the Borders, Provost of Aberdeen, and recipient of the French Order of Saint Michel. And now we're just going to take a break for a word from our sponsors.
As a podcast network, our first priority has always been audio and the stories we're able to share with you. But at Realm, we also sell some pretty cool merch, and organizing that was made both possible and easy with Shopify. When you think about successful businesses like Aloe or Allbirds or Skims, an often overlooked secret is the business behind the business that makes selling and, for shoppers, buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. That's because nobody does selling better than Shopify. It's the home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And the not-so-secret secret that's definitely worth talking about is that Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%. That's more happy customers and way more sales going. If you're hoping to grow your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling, on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more, sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout we use with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/realm, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/realm to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/realm.
Ah, the web tour. Those that both created and were created by the threads disentangle from the fringes to feast on the very thing that spawned them.
What's up, Tilly? This is how you deal with weird!
No! Do not harm my children!
Oh, you lost a feather. Can I keep it?
No, you can't force me to!
Do you know what lies within nothing?
Rocket's in trouble, Akasa! Can we turn on the windshield remotely?
No, she could lose her job as an Akasar.
I don't fear Vehar.
No, but you fear me. If you intend to trick me, I will not hesitate to sever the oath bond entirely.
Why didn't you help me? Coward! I don't have a parachute! I don't like free falling!
Counterbalance, a high fantasy audio drama. Season 2, coming 15th of October 2023. Learn more on trilunas.com.
People often look at me with confusion when I ask them what their only one in the room story is. They think it has to be like mine, where I went to a 600-person event and discovered that I was the only Black person there. I know. Horrifying, right? Hi, I'm Laura Cathcart-Robbins, and I am the host and creator of the podcast Only One in the Room. Every week, my co-host Scott Slaughter and I invite you to join us for an hour and lose yourself in someone's only one story. This podcast is for anyone who has ever felt alone in a room full of people, which is to say that this podcast is for everyone.
I'm Brennan Storr, I'm Paul Bestall.
We're the Ghost Story Guys.
And every 2 weeks, we explore first-person stories of encounters with the paranormal from all around the world.
Then we have some fun reacting to those stories. We like to say our goal is to scare the hell out of you, then make you laugh.
Belief in the paranormal is not required. All you need is a love of great storytelling and curiosity about the world around you.
Come find the Ghost Story Guys on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else fine podcasts live, or at ghoststoryguys.com.
And we're back. So not just the most powerful man in the north of Scotland, but also the most powerful Catholic nobleman in the country. And his family, the Huntleys, were also vaguely related to the Scottish royal family in the way that it seems like everybody is because of all these illegitimate children from all these men called King James. So Cock of the North's oldest son was called Alexander, and he was married to the daughter of Arran. And then later, his other son, George, was married to Arran's other daughter. So just because of all these connections, Mary wanted him on the council because he was powerful, connected, and also Catholic. Like, she wanted the most powerful Catholic to be on her team. The English called him King of the North and sometimes Terror of the English. So, a little trip. Mary went on a trip to Crichton Castle to attend the wedding of her half-brother, not Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart, a different half-brother. She had numerous half-siblings. So Crichton Castle, and also this was a match that she had match-made. One of her hobbies was matchmaking for other people. So the wedding was being held at Crichton Castle because that was the bride's home base. She was called Janet Hepburn. My cat's name is Hepburn. Her first name is not Janet. Anyway, Janet Hepburn, no relation to my cat, but I know of. But definite relation to the Earl of Hepburn, who we discussed before. So, to recap, Janet's dad was Patrick Hepburn, who was the guy who had tried to win the hand of Marie de Guise to the extent that he, I believe, divorced his wife, even though Marie de Guise hadn't said she would marry him, and in fact, she did not. And then he died, Patrick. His son is James Bothwell. We're going to call him Bothwell because everyone's called James. So Janet's brother was Bothwell, a military guy who Marie de Guise had trusted to deliver a message to Mary that one time in episode 1. I believe I talked about this. Anyway, Mary is just like happy to attend a wedding so she could just let loose and dance. Remember, her favorite activity and one of her biggest talents was dancing. And so as she would prove to be, she was very generous. She would often pay for the bride's dresses when women who she match-made were getting married. She'd buy them expensive gifts. But no, she was still wearing her just black ensembles. She's still in mourning and wanting to like kind of fit in and kind of look like business professional. But because it's getting into the colder winter months at this point, so she'd wear like black, but like black velvet, and she'd have fancy headwear, sparkling earrings, rings, and necklaces. So like she's all in black, but it's like make it fashion. So, which is not the kind of black that someone like John Knox would wear, which is like, I don't know. His whole thing is just like plain. Everything should be plain. Decorations are a sign of the devil or whatever. Mary also, even though, and I respect this, she's 6 feet tall and she also liked to wear high heels. She was a heels girl. Pointy toe shoes were on trend. So she stepped out wearing these pointy toe, high heeled shoes, letting loose on the dance floor, not unlike in the early season of Reign. In the season 1, episode 1 of Reign, we see her dancing. Like she and the Marys liked a dance party. There were fireworks at this wedding celebration because that was a big thing in Scotland at the time. And in fact, Mary's father and her grandfather had been big fans of fireworks. Later on, when her like personal library was inventoried, there was a book there called The Art of Fire, postscript. A few weeks after this wedding, Bothwell, the brother of the bride, he like instigated a fight with Arran Jr. I need to mention that Arran Jr. is constantly described as being mentally unwell, unstable, just kind of like, that's who he is. No one's like, oh, is he going to like scheme and do a lot of stuff? It's more just kind of like, he's unpredictable. Anyway, so Bothwell instigated a fight with Arran Jr. And in the fallout, Arran Jr., so like they got in a fight. And then Arran Jr. would then later make claims against him. He said that Bothwell had been planning at this wedding to kidnap the queen, to kill her chief ministers, and incarcerate her in another castle. But he said that like Bothwell was planning this with him, Arran Jr. So both of the men were thrown in prison for treason, for allegedly maybe trying to kidnap the queen. And this is interesting. Put a pin in this for later, because at the time people just thought, oh, these are just the ravings of an insane person. Like, of course, Bothwell wasn't doing that. But put a pin in that. Anyway, so they're both thrown in prison for treason. Bothwell escaped because this is a story in which no one ever stays in jail ever. He fled abroad to Norway, and we'll hear about that, how that turned out in a later episode. Arran Jr. was jailed for 4 years, and then he went into house arrest, and he just was like basically bedridden with his various things he had going on. So anyway, Mary, she liked to travel around, and this was also Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart encouraged her to do this, and I think it was a good idea to travel around the country to see it and to meet more of her subjects so they could see her and they would be more likely to be loyal to her, and this was in fact effective. So during one of these progresses, she went to Stirling, which is the fortress-esque castle where she lived as a little baby. And one night while she was there, a candle on a table beside her pillow set her bed curtains on fire in the middle of the night while she was asleep. Smoke filled the room, and this is in an era before smoke detectors. And she was lucky to escape before she was suffocated. And my notes here are just like, this is like, I feel like the writers of Reign saw this and were like, we're going to invent a character called Clarissa who lives under Mary's bed and both seems to be trying to kill her and also seems to be trying to save her. So this incident had big Clarissa vibes. That means nothing if you haven't watched Reign, but if you have, my notes just say Clarissa. Anyway, so she's in Stirling. And then she went to see Mass in the chapel, like every castle has its own chapel. And she was like, remember, there's the deal. She's like, everyone can be Protestant, but I am going to stay Catholic and I'm still going to go to Catholic masses. And so she went to the chapel at Stirling, and this is the same chapel where, as a little 6-day-old baby, or I guess she was a couple months at that point, the place where she'd been crowned baby queen so many years ago. But then Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart showed up, and he forced her chaplains to leave. But why? And he was like, oh, because loophole. He's like, I said that you could have Catholic Mass at Holyrood, but you can't have Catholic Mass anywhere else, only at that one place, which is just like not what he meant and not the intent of what he meant, but like literally the words of what he had said. So he was doing this mostly just so that the asshole Protestants would still support him, but it's a pretty shitty thing to do to his sister. So then Mary, on her progress next, went to Perth, and she was confronted by Protestants who yelled at her and things, and she suddenly felt sick and had to go indoors to recover. No kidding. And then eventually she went back home to Holyrood. So December 5th, 1561 is the first anniversary of Francis's death, her first husband. And so she was like, okay, I'm going to remember my dead husband, who I truly loved, who I grew up with. And so she put the palace into mourning for 2 days. She ordered all kinds of black fabric, like black velvet, black velvet to be used in special masses, to be sung in her private chapel. She wore white, a change from her usual black, but the special services she was holding, like the memory masses for Francis, were not attended by very many people except for the most loyal of her servants, because most of her household were afraid if they attended Catholic services, they would be beaten up by gangs of Protestants, and they were probably right. The asshole lords, of course, did not attend, and she had asked them, like, well, can you just wear mourning clothes for the day? They also did not do that because they were assholes. Christmas is approaching, it's December, and so she threw parties. She's just like, it's a young, vibrant group of people, and she's just like, let's just have fun like they do in France. Somebody recorded that her parties, what they wrote was, the ladies here be merry, leaping and dancing, lusty and fair. And so throwing the parties, but also she's doing like the Bobby Burke from Queer Eye, just like really upgrading the palaces to a state of splendor. Once all of her stuff arrived from the ships, like she's got the rug, she's got 100 tapestries were unpacked, 36 Turkish carpets. She sat on a gilded throne, which was high-backed and upholstered with crimson velvet and cloth of gold. Low stools are set out for the Marys and folding stools for important visitors, all covered in velvet. So just like an elegant, fancy situation. And she had this vast wardrobe I talked about, but so she was wearing black all the time, except at the parties where she would wear her colorful, cute outfits when she's like off-duty queen. She also loved costumes, disguises. And because she was 6 feet tall, if she dressed in men's clothes, she could maybe be mistaken for a man, and that is what she did. So sometimes she and the Marys would run incognito, or they thought, through the streets of Edinburgh. They would put on men's clothes, pants, and just like go hang around and just be like, hello, fellow men, and just have a nice time. Sometimes they'd also put on disguises to dress as like peasants, to go shopping at the market, pretending they were like normal people. And at a masque, at a banquet in honor of the French ambassador at one point, Mary and the Marys appeared dressed in their men's outfits, which made everybody go like, oh, Herman, my pills. Like, it's so, I can't entirely wrap my head around like the Protestant and Catholic of it all, but the Protestants were like, no one should dress fancy. No one should do anything other than pray all the time. And I don't know, something about showing up in pants was just like especially shocking to them for some reason. So, I mentioned before she had 2 female fools or court jesters whose names are Janet Mouche and Nicolas la Jardinière. And the role of these 2 was to provide irreverent commentary on contemporary political events and personalities. They were cherished members of the household. I love that she had 2 female fools. It was like her version of like the Daily Show or whatever, just kind of like making her laugh. Mary was a very athletic person. So she liked regular exercise. So not unlike Empress Sisi, she would ride a horse every day, sometimes alone for up to 3 hours. She also liked going hunting a lot, maybe because it's a sport you could do while being on a horse. She also liked hawking. She took to it actually right away, apparently in hawking, like or falconry, I think it's called, where you have like the falcon and it lands in your arm. Like she was very good at that. She also enjoyed archery, anything to do with horses. And when it was cold or rainy or just late at night, she would stay in and play chess, cards, or billiards, often staying up late gambling. Like in terms of work-life balance, I think she nails it here. Like when it's time to party, like she just parties. When it's time to work, she will work. I admire that. But of course, John Knox hated fun. Okay, so he complained that she kept herself very serious when she was in the presence of her advisors. But then when the Marys came around or there's a party, then she would like let loose and have a good time. And I don't know if he found that was like meant she was inconstant or something, but like, guess what? People can have different vibes in different situations. He also didn't like her outfits because clothes were subject to moral judgment in his world / that of the Protestant Reformation. Luxury fabric was looked upon by him as a sign of vanity. They wanted these unadorned outfits as a sign of respect for God. So anyway, Mary, like, again, every time there's a man in the story, I was like, he can't be important later, can he? Oh, God damn it, he is. So just another name to add to this whole situation. So a guy called George Buchanan is on the scene. He's like an old man, and he's a poet. He'd also just returned to Scotland. He had been banished like 20 years before because of his political cartoons. That happened to somebody else in the Hortense Mancini episode. It was his friend, her old man friend. He had been like kicked out of France for like political cartoons or something. Anyway, George Buchanan. So he had gone to Paris. That's where he'd been for 20 years. And while in Paris, he met Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart, who'd been there for university, and they hit it off to the point that Buchanan was like, Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart should be the king of Scotland, not Mary. They were both Protestants, I should mention. So it was likely the influence of Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart who got Buchanan the gig as Mary's instructor, which seemed to be more of like, I don't know if he like assigned her reading or whatever, but she was a young person. She was 18. But he also became sort of like the poet, the court poet. He would write the plays that were performed at the masque parties. And so like with Alice Spencer and that whole family, like Mary and the Marys would star in these performances as goddesses and nymphs, which again, they did on the show Reign. So yeah, he was recognized as her official court poet. And then a thing happened where Twelfth Night, which are the like after Christmas revels that you do, they were celebrating by doing the tradition of Queen of the Bean, which is a tradition in which a bean was baked into a cake, and whoever found the bean was queen for the day. That was an episode of Reign, and the person who got the bean was called Penelope, and she usurped, this was in France, she usurped Catherine de Medici, and then got the King of France into like a sub-dom relationship. Reign is a great show, like no flaws, perfect show. In this situation, the person who got the bean was one of the 4 Marys. It was Mary Fleming. And in this situation, what Mary Fleming did was she just acted as queen for the day, and Mary Queen of Scots acted as her like servant. And we know that they like, she and her friends like disguises and play acting. So I'm sure they had a really nice time. Yeah, so because she liked dancing and parties, she kept minstrels and musicians on her payroll. She had a consort of 5 viol, and I'm not sure if a viol is a violin or a viola, players and 3 lute players. Some of her valets sang and played the lute too. She also liked wind instruments. She had several pipers and an oboe player, later adding trumpets, fifes, drums, and tabors. Her domestic staff formed a choir, which sang at her evening functions. And I just like this detail as well. She invented a new kind of party, which was an equestrian masque, which is a way that she could ride a horse while also wearing a costume and acting in a play, which is just the most Mary Queen of Scots thing I can imagine. And I'm sure this guy, Buchanan, was just like, you want me to write you what? A play where you're being who? Meanwhile, so England. So on the scene, the English ambassador is a guy named Randolph. Messy bitch, loves her drama. We love this in an ambassador because that means he writes lots of bitchy, gossipy things, which people put into books that I then read. So she was like, Randolph, can you help me get in touch with Elizabeth in England? Because although I'm saying Mary has the parties, she's got the Marys with her, she's got her half-brother, she's very lonely, actually. Like, nobody gets her completely. Like, when she was in France, she hung out, like, Francis was the king, and then the other women there were the princesses. Like, they were sort of on her same level. But here, like, no one, as much as I love the Marys, like, they didn't get it. Like, they didn't know what it was like to be her. And who Mary saw as the only person who maybe could, like, be her soulmate in that way was Queen Elizabeth, who is the Queen of England right now. But she also knew that, like, John Knox and the others would probably respect her, Mary, more if and when she was able to get Elizabeth to say, Mary Queen of Scots is my official heir to the throne. So she really wanted to get Elizabeth to name her heir to the throne of England. And because Mary Queen of Scots was so friendly and outgoing and charming, she figured that she could maybe use her charm to, like, figure out a way that she could meet Elizabeth and just figure this out face to face. Speaking of Elizabeth, at this time, so Elizabeth had become the Queen of England when she was 25. So she's like 10 years-ish older than Mary. So she's been queen for a bit in England by now. Elizabeth had not yet gotten married. Again, I'm telling this story, trying to not put too much of, like, what I know is going to happen into it. But there were rumors at this time that Elizabeth might get married because the person she'd been hanging around a lot with was a man whose name was Robert Dudley, who we're going to call Bobby Duds. And so the thing about this is that Bobby Duds was already married. He had a wife whose name was Amy. But then, what do you know? One day, Amy was found dead at the bottom of a strangely short flight of stairs, and it seemed like she had been maybe murdered, or maybe she tripped and fell, or maybe she killed herself. No one knew what had happened, but it just, like, looked bad for Bobby Duds. Because, like, option one is, like, did he murder his wife so he could marry Elizabeth? Like, in which case, Elizabeth could marry a wife murderer. But then it's like, did Elizabeth arrange the murder so she could marry Bobby Duds? In which case, again, like, then she's a murderer. Like, the whole, truly nobody knows to this day. It's a famous unsolved murder. So just so when we get into this thing about John Knox being like, oh, we women leaders are too lusty and scandalous, except for Elizabeth, she's an exception because she's Protestant. It's like, there's two queens in this story. And one of them is like an 18-year-old widow who likes to have dance parties. And one of them is like a 30-year-old woman who maybe got her lover to kill his wife. And John Knox is like, one is good as one is bad. And it's like, fuck you, John Knox. Anyway, so Mary and Elizabeth started being pen pals. So she wrote to her being like, you know, what about making me your heir? And Elizabeth was like, I don't know. Because, like, especially she's not going to put anything in writing. But Elizabeth's whole thing, and this is part of where she was really successful, is she never committed to things unless she, like, was going to. So anyway, Mary really wanted to push this to a face-to-face meeting. And the thing is, Elizabeth also was like, maybe Mary should be my heir. Because we talked about this in the Lady Jane Grey season. But who is going to be Elizabeth's heir? Like, the fact that Elizabeth was on the throne was really due to a lack of any other options. So at this point, Elizabeth's heirs were the Grey sisters. So that's Catherine and Mary Grey, the younger sisters of Lady Jane Grey. And Elizabeth didn't want them to be queen because they weren't royal, you know, whereas Mary Queen of Scots was royal. But also Catherine Grey had defied Elizabeth's wishes. She had secretly gotten married without permission and was currently in jail, where she got pregnant again because she was in jail with her husband twice. Elizabeth's main guy, her main advisor, was William Cecil, and he preferred the Grey sisters as heirs. But Elizabeth did actually at this point prefer Mary because Mary was a queen with zero scandal around her. And although she was Catholic, she was claiming to be cool with Protestants. So, like, maybe this could work at this point. But William Cecil knew, like, because he had spies everywhere and he was in contact with a bunch of people in Scotland. And he knew that Mary was very personally persuasive, charismatic, magnetic. He knew if these two women met, Mary might be able to persuade Elizabeth to name her heir. William Cecil did not want that to happen, so he got to work just like cock blocking this meeting. Meanwhile, Mary, like lots of people wanted to marry Mary. We're going to talk about a lot of them in the next episode, but she was rejecting them all. She joked she would have no one but Elizabeth. She sent a picture of herself to Elizabeth, which is mostly just a way because she wanted Elizabeth to send a picture of her. She just wanted to know what Elizabeth looked like. But then her uncles, the de Guises back in France, fucked this all up. So her uncle, the Duke of Guise, I think this is her uncle Francis, aka Frank, was just like going through a village where some Huguenot Protestants were worshipping in a barn, and then his men fired muskets at them, killing 23 and wounding 100. And what this showed was that to people like William Cecil, I mean, it seemed like the de Guise family were on a religious crusade to kill all Protestants, and they might come across the English Channel and do that in Scotland and or England as well. And they're, of course, Mary's family. So she knew that this hurt her cause for everything, for religious tolerance, like to be cool with Elizabeth. So she spoke to the English ambassador, Randolph, to try to distance herself from her uncle's actions, being like, that's them, they're fucked up, I'm not like that. But this just made William Cecil even more determined that these two queens couldn't meet, but Elizabeth was like, fuck you, yes we will. So Elizabeth planned a meeting between them in York. Mary wrote, I honor her in my heart and love her as my dear and natural sister. Like she was so excited they were going to meet. But then 9 days later, Elizabeth changed her mind because of kind of the ripple effects of this whole Mary's uncle massacre situation. So she canceled on her. Mary was so upset she took to her bed and refused to move or to speak to anyone. And I mean, her uncles did kind of cause wars of religion in France. And this the first of the wars of religion in France. And England intervened there, like they were supporting the Huguenots against the de Guise faction. It just basically meant that like Mary and Elizabeth could not meet each other just because of like political stuff. And Mary was just really caught in the middle of this like French situation. If she declared her support for the de Guise family, then that would be putting her in opposition to Elizabeth, and maybe a war would happen. But if she sided with Elizabeth, she would be accused of betraying her family and her religion. So she's just like, what am I going to do? Since she couldn't go hang out with her cousin, Elizabeth, Mary was like, well, I had these weeks booked off, so I should be able to take another trip. So she, at the suggestion of Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart, she took a royal progress to northeastern Scotland to see more of the country and show herself to the subjects up there. And you know that she was excited about it because she prepared by ordering a whole lot of fabric, thread, and trimmings to make new outfits for her and for the Marys, all still in black for official purposes. Yeah, and so she headed up north for this trip to meet and greet her subjects. And turns out she loved the Highlanders. And I just need to reveal at this point, I think I've mentioned on this podcast before that much of my own personal ancestry is from Scotland. And I've recently learned that from many branches of my family tree were in fact Highlanders. So I love that Mary's visiting Highlanders, and I love that she loved the Highlanders. And they liked her too. We all vibe. Maybe that's why I like her so much. Mary, in fact, she loved their whole deal. She ordered Highland outfits for herself to like cosplay as Highlanders. She ordered plaid for her courtiers. Yeah, she was just like, let's all wear plaid. Like, this is the vibe, plaidcore. But one of the reasons why her brother really wanted her to go up there, one of the reasons why she was going up there was to deal with Cock o' the North, who, it's important to note here, the Cock o' the North and Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart did not get along. They never really had. And Mary was turning to Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart for advice, and he was like, Cock of the North is dangerous. So Mary believed him. So at this point, Cock of the North, he's like a man in his 40s. He'd lived a hard, stressful life full of battles, being imprisoned, etc. So remember when Mary first arrived in Scotland on that like gloomy day 2 days early? She arrived in Leith, which is down near Edinburgh in what I believe is the Lowlands. But while she's still studying her plans of where to go, Cock of the North and his allies had been encouraging her to land instead in Aberdeen, which is further north, because he was like, if you land there, you can, like, Cock of the North could summon the Catholic nobles in the region, and maybe they could lead a Catholic army down together to make Scotland Catholic again and, like, end the Reformation. Cock of the North, like I mentioned before, like, he was really influential, but he could summon an army of, like, 20,000 people on a moment's notice because like they all loved him and they were like ready to follow him into battle. Interestingly, He also, before she went to Scotland, Cock of the North was like, you should land there. And she's like, I don't know. But then he's like, also just like heads up, like maybe don't trust your brother, Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart, which her mother had also said. But Mary was just like, I think I will. Maybe Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart had that same Stewart family charisma where you just like want to trust him. I don't know. Anyway, so at this point, like remember he was on her privy council and stuff, but I also said, remember everyone is switching teams all the sides. So what happened at this point is that Cock of the North was mad that Mary had planned to meet with Elizabeth because Cock of the North didn't fuck with Elizabeth. He didn't like Protestants. He didn't like England. And he did not hide that he disapproved of this. Like, remember, he went to the John Knox sermons and like pulled his bonnet over his face. Like he didn't hide his emotions well, but he felt confident to speak his mind to Mary because he was so powerful. He had all these connections. Like he personally, I mentioned before, he was descended from the royal family. So he was descended from Mary's grandfather. I think he was an illegitimate son of Mary's grandfather, something like that. So he'd been raised at court with Margaret Tudor, Mary's grandmother, as his guardian. He hung out and grew up with his cousin J5, Mary's dad, as kids. He was also Chancellor of Scotland. So he kind of felt safe speaking his mind. He's also Catholic, and you figure like, Mary's Catholic, Catholic to Catholic, she'll get this. At least one point we know of, Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart and Cock of the North argued publicly in front of Mary. So they're going up north, and she just wanted to be like, listen, Cock of the North, like, let's get along, whatever. But Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart was like, or maybe we can like take away all of his lands and titles. So they set it with an armed guard comprised mostly of haters of Cock of the North, was who Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart had gotten to be their like people they were going up there with. So first they got to Aberdeen, where she was greeted by Cock of the North's wife, the Countess Elizabeth, Lady Huntley, who we're just going to call the Countess. And she was waiting there with around 1,500 armed troops. Mary had been expecting 100. So this was kind of like a bit startling to her to be like, ooh, is Cock of the North like threatening me? What's going on? But the Countess didn't want to talk about him at all. She wanted to request, because her son, Cock of the North's son, had been arrested. I forget if I talked about this, but I'll remind you if I hadn't. So he had cut off another guy's arm with a sword and then had escaped prison and run to hide up north. And so the Countess was like, please show leniency to my son. He cut off another guy's arm, but he's a really nice guy. And Mary was like, okay, if your son surrenders here, we'll put him on trial in Aberdeen. And the Countess was like, okay, great, cool, we'll do that. But then the son learned that his jailer, like if he revealed himself, the jailer would be this longtime family enemy who was also Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart's uncle. And so the son ran away. Again, he didn't trust this. But instead of going into hiding, this son, I'm just going to call him the son because there's a lot of sons. The son of Cock of the North. He summoned his men and began following the progress, like following Mary Queen of Scots to maybe kidnap her. He was, some people thought, maybe infatuated with her. And this is the double-edged sword of being an extremely attractive, charismatic person. You're going to get stalkers. Anyway, so he was just like on the run, but following them. Also, like that other guy from before, like he wanted to marry Mary, but the son, he already had a wife. So, but divorce was kind of like no big deal to them. Anyway, a warrant was put out for his arrest, and it's like, turn around, he's behind you. So this is happening. Cock of the North and the Countess had invited Mary to come visit them at his castle. Remember his like nice French themed castle, but Mary refused to go there because she was like, no, that's obviously a trap for your son to kidnap me. So she bypassed them. She didn't visit them at their castle. She went to a different castle. And at that castle, she officially pronounced that she had made her half-brother, Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart, now the Earl of Moray. And she had actually already done this, but she hadn't publicly announced it because she knew that it would upset Cock of the North because he used to have that title and he like oversaw those lands and he wanted that title. So doing this publicly was kind of like a passive-aggressive or potentially aggressive insult to Cock of the North. And this is also why Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart in many biographies is just called Moray because he became the Earl of Moray. But I call him Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart, and I will never stop. So Mary's group went on to the royal castle of Inverness, which was under the care of Cock of the North's other son, Alexander. Having heard the way that Mary treated his dad, or his family, Alexander didn't let her into this castle. And then a rumor got to Mary. Well, Mary was obviously like mad about this, and she's like, I'm the fucking queen, like what the fuck is this? And then a rumor got to Mary that Cock of the North himself maybe wanted to kidnap and marry her, despite having a wife who was amazing, the Countess. So many rumors, so many kidnappings. This one, I feel like Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart might have started this rumor. Anyway, so he's just like this little like, is the parrot literally called Iago in Disney's Aladdin movie? Because when I say Iago, I'm not picturing the Shakespeare play, I'm picturing the Disney movie, animated movie Aladdin. But Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart is just like, yes, we must destroy, conquer the North, where it's kind of like the Lord of the Rings guy, Gollum. If you haven't noticed yet, Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart is a piece of shit. I didn't want to come out and say that at the beginning, so you could just like be there with Mary and like, okay, this is who she trusts. Okay, he's got good judgment. No, he's a piece of shit, and I'm happy to reveal that to you. I tried not to spoil that as long as I could, but it's getting unavoidable. So, but Mary is starting to notice that too. Anyway, so at this point, like things are just like spiraling out of control. Conquer the North was hard at work, trying to get people from the south of the country to join with the Northeast against the Queen in some sort of like revolution. So on learning this, Mary pronounced Conquer the North and his son, John, the one who's on the run in the first place, outlaws. So yeah, in my notes here, I just said that, but in my notes I also have this. Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart is like Gollum, like, yes, sister, send for reinforcements. And so she did, including a man with a great name, Sir William Kirkcaldy of Grange. He's going to show up a couple more times, and you're going to remember that name because it's a memorable name. He's a great soldier, and every time he appears, it's in some sort of like soldier capacity where it's like, we need the best soldier, Kirkcaldy of Grange. So he attempted to capture Conquer the North while he was at his castle having a meal, but Conquer the North heard about this, and he managed to escape by climbing over the back wall, no shoes on, no weapons, and then he outran his pursuers on his horse. Meanwhile, his wife, the Countess, had gone to see a local witch to get a prophecy about what she should do, which is like, honestly, no shade at all. Like how many people, how many of us go to tarot cards, fortune tellers? Like, so she listened to a witch, and a local witch was like, Conquer the North won't come to harm if he goes to this specific place, Corici. But there's going to be a real Macbeth-esque twist to this. Like, it's like no harm will come to his body at Corici or something. So the Countess was like, listen, Conquer the North, my husband, like, go challenge the Queen in battle. The witches said no harm will come to you. So he's like, okay, like, let's do what the witch says. And so with a 700-person army, he headed to the Hill of Fare at Corici. Meanwhile, Mary has her force. So Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart is there. The Scottish Machiavelli is in charge as well. She had like 2,000 people, so more than twice as many. There was this battle. More than 220 men were killed. 120 were taken prisoner, including Conquer the North and 2 of his sons. As he was being taken off prisoner, Conquer the North suddenly fell from his horse, dead of a heart attack or a stroke. And this is like, so the witches had said like, oh, if he goes to Corici, he won't be hurt in battle or something. And so the Countess was like, yeah, go there, you won't be hurt in battle. But he wasn't hurt in battle, but he died of a heart attack after losing a battle. So it's a real Macbeth adjacent. Scottish witch fortunes, you gotta really look for loopholes. Anyway, so his son, John, did not die of a heart attack. He was taken for execution. So Mary and the Marys went to like witness the execution. They're like, let's see an execution. Like, we love the Highlands. We're wearing our plaids. Like, it was one of those big sort of like oldie time execution parties, but it was a badly done. It was a botched execution. If you go to Vulgar History Pod on Instagram, I have the Vulgar History bingo card. And one of the things on that is in fact botched execution, I believe, because it seems like, I guess when an execution goes okay, people don't write about it, but it feels like every execution I've mentioned on the show, something goes wrong. Anyway, so the guy doing the execution, not good, kept missing. The executioner kept missing, so he had to swing over and over. Mary eventually fainted. And seeing this, some of the like Scots women were like, oh, what's wrong with her? Like, get over it. Like, you gotta be rough and tough like us Scots ladies. But to be fair, to quote Rosemary Goring in her biography of Mary, it had been a difficult month. So we talked about her illness symptoms last time, I think. And so when she is stressed, that often makes Mary have trouble with her appetite. And when she doesn't eat enough, then her like porphyria type symptoms kick in again. So she fell ill shortly after her return to Edinburgh. So this might have been a porphyria kicking in thing, but also it almost sounds like her symptoms and the way it spread around the court, it might have been the first appearance in Scotland of influenza. Anyway, she got better. Also coming along back to Edinburgh was the dead corpse of Conquer the North, because he was going to be put on trial, but as a corpse. So this is, again, I don't know if this is on the Vulgar History bingo sheet, but this is another recurring motif, which is dead body treated as living person. His body was basically mummified and filled with spices, embalmed, and kept in storage until he could be put on trial as a corpse for treason, I guess. Anyway, meanwhile, the Countess and their daughter, Jean, also traveled south to Edinburgh because Mary and Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart had seized their castle and took all their stuff, like their tapestries, like all their furniture, their beds. There's like a weird shortage of beds in this era in Scotland. And so now the Countess and Jean were going to join Mary's court as courtiers, like maybe as like ladies in waiting, because they were vaguely related to her. And so she sort of had a responsibility to take care of them despite everything that just went down. Meanwhile, Cock of the North had another adult son, George, aka Cock of the North Jr., is what we're going to call him, to keep the memory of Cock of the North ever alive. So Cock of the North Jr. was still alive. Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart tried to get Mary to issue a warrant for his execution, but she wouldn't because she started to be like, starting to see her brother's kind of a piece of shit, getting her to start a civil war just so he could become the Earl of Moray. But so Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart stole a secret warrant from her. So I don't know if that's like stealing, like a pharmacist's like prescription pad with a signature on it and putting on the prescription yourself. He stole a secret warrant from her, then rode off to see Cock of the North Jr. and ordered the captain of the castle where he was staying to execute him. The captain of the guard saw through these obvious lies and didn't do it. He's like, well, let's just double check with Mary that this warrant is like, okay. When Mary found out, she forbade the execution and in fact took Cock of the North Jr. under her personal protection, as she was obviously coming to realize her brother Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart was a piece of shit, and that actually maybe she shouldn't have fucked over the entire Gordon family because she needed them to support her as Catholics and to counterbalance Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart's increasing amount of power. And then 7 months after his death, the undead corpse of Cock of the North was put on trial for treason. So they like propped up his coffin so it looked like he was standing. And he was put on trial, and guess what? He's found guilty. But even John Knox was like, this whole thing is clearly just a setup to get more power for Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart. Like, clearly. Meanwhile, the like ordinary people of Scotland were facing famine. Like the country, in terms of just like agriculture, was like not doing well, especially in the north. Many people died of hunger. John Knox saw this as divine punishment for Mary's actions, e.g. dancing and wearing dresses with embroidery on it. Meanwhile, in France, her uncles, the Dickies uncles, continued to slaughter Protestants. Elizabeth wrote to Mary to be like, what the fuck is up with your uncles? But then also she got a further letter revealing that Elizabeth had contracted smallpox. Mary had had smallpox as a child, and she knew that it sucked, and she knew that a big concern for people was like, am I going to have scarring after? So she's like, hey, I didn't get any scars. I'm sure you'll be fine too. She wrote back a letter hoping Elizabeth would get well soon. But also, if Elizabeth died, Mary was at this point positioned to maybe take over as the new queen. But then Mary fell ill again. She found out that Elizabeth had gotten better, and she knew that she needed a more secure investment in getting the becoming heir to the English throne. Like, friendship with Elizabeth was clearly not, pen pal friendship was not going to give her the power and the security that she needed, especially because William Cecil was trying to bar Mary from ever being Queen of England via an act of exclusion. So her best option was going to be to get a husband that would help secure her dynastic rights in England. And next week, we're going to talk about Mary Queen of Scots and the search for a husband. So a couple housekeeping things. First of all, I'm really excited to tell you that I've got this all sorted. I'm working with an organization called The Wordery, who does transcriptions of podcasts. So starting in June, transcripts of new episodes, and then we'll be working backwards from the new episodes, will be available if you go to vulgarhistory.com and just click on the episode you want the transcript for, and then there should be a little thing there you can click on to read a transcript of it if you prefer to read podcasts rather than to listen to them. And the transcripts are by Aveline Malek of The Wordery. Also, a reminder that our store, I'm laughing because there was a quote, from John Knox. In his will, he was talking about, he has a quote where he's saying, I've been such a good man all my life. And one of the things he said was, merchandise I have not made. And I laughed out loud because I was like, oh, merchandise I have made that says, where's your God now, John Knox? So I just appreciate every time you buy some of the Where's Your God Now, John Knox merch. It bothers him. And that makes me happy. So anyway, the merch currently. So if you go to vulgarhistory.com/store, that takes you to our TeePublic store. And that's the best option for people in the US, like in terms of shipping costs and things like that. If you live not in the US, if you go to vulgarhistory.redbubble.com, that's where you'll get better shipping on things internationally. And all those links will be in the show notes. So again, if you're in the US, vulgarhistory.com/store. If you're anywhere else, vulgarhistory.redbubble.com. And the stuff in the store right now, I'm so happy with it. The designs are delightful and they're all done by artists who I worked with to design these specifically. So there's Where's Your God Now, John Knox, themed merchandise designed by Jennifer Ferguson, who is a member of the Tits Out Brigade. And there is also Renaissance Reformation Girl Squad and Goth Queen Mom Friend merch designed by Karen Moynihan from the Double Love Sweet Valley High podcast. Jan Upater has designed Catherine de Medici's Flying Squadron merch. And so you can get all of that in these stores. There's we're talking mugs, t-shirts, stickers, magnets, tote bags, all of it. It's there. And then also if you want to support this show in another way, there's my Patreon. So if you go to patreon.com/AnnFosterWriter, and that is where if you just pledge money, basically whatever amount per month. So $1 a month, you get early ad-free access to all episodes of Vulgar History. If you pledge at least $5 or more a month, then you get the early ad-free access to all episodes of Vulgar History, as well as you get Patreon exclusive bonus podcasts like So This Asshole, where I talk about gross men from history. And I've had 2 people so far ask me, and I feel like by the time this episode comes out, more will have asked me. They're like, have you not done So This Asshole John Knox? Will you do So This Asshole John Knox? My response is, I don't know if I can. I hate him so much. But I feel like by the end of these Mary Queen of Scots episodes, I will have, against my will, learned enough about him. I could do a John Knox episode, but here's what I'm going to say. Right now I have 392 supporters on Patreon. If and when I get to 500 supporters on Patreon, I will do So This Asshole John Knox. So that is my deal for you. And you can also follow me on Instagram, where I'm at Vulgar History Pod. And on TikTok, I'm at Vulgar History. And next week, more Mary Queen of Scots content. So thank you all for listening. And until next time, like Mary Queen of Scots herself, keep your pants on, and then unlike her. Well, although philosophically, tits out. Vulgar History is hosted, written, and researched by Ann Foster and edited by Christina Lumagi.
Welcome to the small town of Chinook, where faith runs deep and secrets run deeper. In this new thriller, religion and crime collide when a gruesome murder rocks the isolated Montana community. Everyone is quick to point their fingers at a drug-addicted teenager, but local deputy Ruth Vogel isn't convinced. She suspects connections to a powerful religious group. Enter federal agent V.B. Laureau, who has been investigating a local church for possible criminal activity. The pair form an unlikely partnership to catch the killer, unearthing secrets that leave Ruth torn between her duty to the law, her religious convictions, and her very own family. But something more sinister than murder is afoot, and someone is watching Ruth.
Chinook, starring Kelly Marie Tran and Sanaa Lathan. Listen to Chinook wherever you get your podcasts.
Contained herein are the heresies of Radolf Buntwine, erstwhile monk turned traveling medical investigator. Join me as I study the secrets of the divine plagues and uncover the blasphemous truth that ours is not a loving God, and we are not its favored children. The heresies of Radolf Buntwine, wherever podcasts are available.